There you go, sir. In order of our restaurant's finest fish and chips. Excuse me? Those are bees on my fish and chips. That's right, sir. Fish and chips.
You're in California, Dad.
All jokes aside, the reason why bees are now legally considered fish in the state of California is so that they can be protected as endangered and threatened species. You aren't actually gonna be eating bees and chips in California. At least, I think you don't. I'm just someone watching the states doing things. Here's what happened. In 2018, a group of non-profit organizations petitioned for 4 species of bumblebees to be listed as endangered. The California Fish and Game Commission, which is responsible for the list of endangered species in California, decided that this petition made sense, so they approved it in June 2019. Except, farming groups weren't exactly happy about this. They sued the commission later in September, pointing to the law and said, insects are nowhere to be mentioned here. To which I should point out that earlier in the code, it clearly talks about fish, wildlife and plants being important for preservation.
And it's kind of obvious that laws are usually outdated and doesn't update alongside conservation science progress, so I don't know why this is a point of contention.
But somehow, they managed to convince a district court to agree that insects aren't part of the endangered species law. So the commission looked at section 45, which defines a fish, and says that the definition contains the word invertebrate. Bees are invertebrates. Therefore, bees are fish and should be protected. Perhaps in an attempt to demonstrate the effectiveness of the American legal system, it took another year and a half to decide that bees are indeed fish and should be protected by the statute. And by the way, this interpretation that bees are indeed fish, according to 3 distinguished professors of law, is perfectly normal for a California Court of Appeals. And typical when statutes are drafted in haste. Because it's just like stuff we say verbally, and we're not super precise and explicit about everything we say. That's really the reason why I decided not to include the exact sentences and arguments that the lawyers argued in this case. It's not meant to be precise, and it really doesn't benefit anyone to understand how lawyers played around with semantics. But don't let this ridiculous story and the ridiculous names of the bumblebees like crotch bumblebee and sakikaku bumblebee distract you from the bigger question here. Who would even block something like this? What do they even stand to gain? According to court documents, the plaintiffs are a Almond Alliance of California et al., which includes the following organizations. So basically, a group of nuts. Citrus, cotton growers, and other agricultural groups. It might seem pretty unintuitive that farmers don't want to protect their bumblebees. After all, bees have a symbiotic relationship with flowers, which much of our food supply has. They rely on the flowers of our crops for pollen and nectar, and in turn pollinate blossoms along the way. But here's the thing, the food industry primarily relies on honeybees, not native bumblebees, as commercially managed pollinators. The honey industry most likely has you believe that most bees are the yellow-striped kind that live in big colonies of hives, but actually more than 90% of the 20,000 species of bees are solitary, and about 70% of them are ground nesting. Hell, most of them don't even make honey. Relying only on the 7 to 12 species of European honeybees is obviously risky, since any changes to honeybee health will directly affect our food supply. And apparently it is also highly inefficient, since wild pollinators enhances crops much more effectively than honeybees. For instance, only a few hundred females of the mason bee, Osmia cornuta, are needed to pollinate a hectare of apples or almond trees, but tens of thousands of honeybee workers would be required. Yet, heavy reliance on the honeybees meant that native bumblebees have declined over the decades because of land use changes, herbicide and pesticide overuse, competition with commercial honeybees. Honeybees have not only displaced native bees from flowers, changed the suite of flowers they visit, reduced their reproductive success, they also tended to spread diseases and pathogens to native bees. But this at least means that honeybees are thriving, right? Right, guys?
Oh my god!
This is not a pile of shit, but a pile of pulverized almond trees and a big reason why bees are dying. This also happens to be about as good an analogy to give the shit show surrounding agriculture in California. Almonds, which is a seed and not a nut, take about 68% and some sources say 90% of all the commercial bees in the United States to pollinate. And I do actually mean that honeybees literally have to be loaded on trucks and shipped across the country, fed substitute food to repopulate their hives 2 months earlier than natural, and then pollinate the almonds when they bloom. And right here, some of us might be inclined to believe that what happens in old America isn't your problem. Wrong. California produces 100% of the United States almonds and 80% of the world's almonds. As long as you eat imported almonds or buy something with almonds, it's something that you affect as well. Arguably, you can say that honeybees are thriving because of growing population numbers. But that argument is about as good as saying that the red jungle fowl is thriving because their descendants end up on my plate as a chicken kebab. Remember, natural honeybees don't usually only feed on almond pollen and nectar, but the almond industry forces them to this kind of monoculture. Honeybees undergoing the stress of transport were not only recorded to have their ability to nurse the next generation of workers affected, they were also recorded to have a significant decrease in lifespan, high oxidative stress levels, and hives also experience considerable temperature stress, which is an important component of annual colony losses. By annual colony losses, I mean that over the 2018 to 2019 winter, roughly 50 billion honeybees have died. Or as one farmer in his Guardian article disclosed, he's losing 30% or more of his bees a year, compared to the 5% per year due to disease or weather before. And that 30% is pretty standard numbers nowadays. You have honeybees dying from varroa mite, new and emerging diseases like the Israeli acute paralysis virus, pesticides, stress, poor nutrition, and sometimes you even have worker bees literally disappearing for no reason and leaving the queen alone, causing entire hives to collapse. Record high levels of stress, highly infectious diseases, poor nutrition, pressure from your masters to reproduce and workers literally disappearing. Where have I heard that before? As for why beekeepers continue to do this, green, not this green, is as good a reason as any. For beekeepers, selling honey isn't even as profitable as renting out their hives as pollinators. Doing so actually only provides half of beekeeping revenue. And this is made possible only because tree nut demand all over the world is growing, which means almond growers can afford to pay big bucks to the beekeepers. It's to the point where almonds have the top California crop acreage, it's the second highest valued commodity behind dairy, and it's the top US specialty crop by export value. The problem here is sustainability. Everybody, including the agricultural groups, know that the system isn't remotely sustainable. So why exactly do agricultural groups oppose saving the bumblebees? Well, they argue that putting bees on the list will affect agriculture, because the bees' home range is basically the entire state. Farmers and growers everywhere would be greatly affected. And because insects aren't as easily trackable as something like a wolf, it's difficult to comply with in the fields. Instead, they posit that the best way to address conservation is to work out voluntary solutions like planting bee habitats on farms. And there is also the economic value that almonds bring, tens of thousands of jobs, yada yada yada. Now, on surface, this story sounds just like the same old story of big corporation prioritizing profits over sustainability. And as usual, we've reached a point too far to go back. But I also didn't want to simplify the issue and paint big agriculture as the bad guys without reading further. So I read further to try to understand why. But, I kind of didn't find a good answer for the big farms. For instance, if you check for agriculture statistics, you might see sentences like California is the top producing state, or that the Central Valley produces a quarter of the nation's food. The problem is that these statements are by cash receipts, rather than by some measure of nutrition value. Much of those cash receipts are things like almonds, other nuts, and wine, which are not staple food like rice or potatoes. If anything, they're luxury food. You might also see misleading statistics like how more than 90% of almond farms are family owned, and that nearly 70% of almond farms are 100 acres or less, giving you an impression that you're supporting small local businesses by buying California almonds. Which are statistics that mislead you from knowing that 50.6% of California cropland are owned by 5% of the owners. The Gini coefficient shows that land ownership is very unequal, or that there are investment funds that own a lot of Californian land, or that lots of farm workers are hired and earn about 30k a year, but typically much less due to the seasonality of the job. A lot of them are also undocumented immigrants, or that despite producing so much of the country's produce, California is the state that has the greatest number of households with food insecurity. And here are more misleading stats from an article by a farmland investment manager targeted at people with a net worth of more than 1 million, titled Dispelling Common Misconception About Almonds' Water Use. Let's take misconception 2. Almonds use more water than any other agricultural product. They argue that in terms of gallons per kilocalorie, almonds outperform sheep and goat meat and are roughly consistent with poultry products, while also significantly outperforming beef. Which I guess they're trying to say that it isn't that bad, but also kind of ignoring the fact that animal agriculture itself isn't exactly sustainable. If we click into the link they gave, the sentences given in the articles were technically true. When compared to meat products, nuts take about an equivalent or better amount of water to produce. But it also ignores the fact that vegetables, starchy roots, fruits and cereals are still way better in terms of water sustainability. The real lesson here in terms of water sustainability is that we should eat less meat and nuts. I could go on arguing about misleading facts, but my point is that although reports from agricultural groups imply that California agriculture is doing well and earning sweet cash, they conceal its sustainability through deceptive statistics, and that profits tend to go to the larger landowners. Yet, they haven't been doing nothing. For instance, almond farmers in California managed to save a third of water savings per acre over the last 20 years using measures such as micro-drip irrigation technology. And remember Osmia Cometa, the wonderful company, that's their real corporate name, is the largest almond grower in the world and also one of the companies opposing the bumblebee listing. And they are researching on Osmia lignaria as a commercially viable alternative to honeybees for almonds. It's just that, as it comes to large corporations and voluntary solutions, their track record hasn't exactly been stellar. Take the billionaires Stewart and Linda Resnick, who owns the wonderful company. They were infamous for aggressively consuming water and expanding their business in California, even as residents faced water shortages with irreversible damages to the water ecosystem. One of their companies, Fiji Water, even takes water from the Fiji Islands and sells them to other wealthy people like Hollywood actors, while most Fijians don't even have access to clean drinking water. Even today, 1 in 10 Fijians still lack access to basic water supply and sanitation. The pollution on the island is just icing on the cake. So it might be hilarious to know that in 2006, Fiji ran an ad saying, "The label says Fiji because it's not bottled in Cleveland." To which the city took offense and ran tests in Fiji branded water, and they found that it contains 6.31 micrograms of arsenic per litre, while Cleveland water had none. The Resnicks also happened to somehow purchase the Kern Water Bank, a critical water resource in California, which doesn't sound right. Why would a billionaire be able to buy a public resource? This article, written more than 10 years ago, explains that for reasons that still seem murky, the state gave the bank up to Kern County water authorities, who then ceded it to a consortium of public and private entities, the largest of which was owned by the Resnicks. Then one of the executives at the company said, "The water bank enabled us to plant permanent crops because they knew it could water its trees even in droughts." So the article alleges that owning the water bank encouraged business decisions that wouldn't otherwise be smart for a semi-arid region. Well, 10 years later, California is still complaining about the same thing amid a drought. You now have almond farmers ripping out trees because water is scarce. Not just the small farms, but large ones as well. It may or may not have been due to a history of shitty practices like this, but I would like to mention that there are now water restrictions for residents of California. And according to this article in 2018, this team of journalists followed workers from the wonderful company back to Lost Hills, which is a very small company town of only less than 3,000 people, mostly working in agriculture. Now at first, you'd think this doesn't sound too bad. They have a new health centers, new pre-K facilities, new housing projects, new gardens, and to quote an article written by a friend of the Resnicks, an emphasis on better health and less diabetes. A non-moralistic way to change behavior. One of the workers gets up at 2:45 AM, hits the gym by 4 AM, and be at work by 6. And is now taking business and law courses online. And wow, they have cheap, healthy meals for $3, made from fresh farm produce like pizza made from cauliflower, a wild salmon with creamed leeks and raw asparagus salad. Until you realize that here, the water comes out of the tap yellow and foul smelling. So a lot of residents have to buy bottled water and stack them up. And as it turns out, someone from Clean Water Action went to Lost Hills and also asked residents if they were happy there, as anybody with a common sense can probably guess. One resident replied that only someone who sits in the office all day might actually go to the gym at 4 AM. Most people already get enough exercise in the fields doing work. Instead, the concern they have is whether the air they are breathing in is making them sick, whether they have clean water. And separate from the Resnick story, in the Tulare County, where there is a population of 460,000 people, the town had a water problem for the last 40 years. 40. They're receiving a buffet of leftovers from the grape, almonds, apricots, blueberries from large-scale farming. And by leftovers, I mean the toxic nitrates, arsenic, 123-TCP, and chromium. And just 10 days before this sentence was written on the script, the county literally ran out of water.
Families rely on bottled water deliveries through a state program. On Thursday, crews lowered the pump another 25 feet to get water. The Tulare County community has had toxic tap water for 40 years. Tuleville wants to consolidate its water system with the neighboring city of Exeter. After a similar water outage last year, the state stepped in and gave both communities a 6-month deadline to come up with a solution. That deadline expired in February and there's still no agreement.
So in case you're concerned about the Fijians, don't worry, Californians have their water problems too. You know, just not for the upper echelon, who are playing real life like some kind of farming tycoon simulator. Now to be fair to the Resnicks, these towns wouldn't exist without them. Some of them had gangs and murders before they were developed by the Resnicks. They've also spent $80 million on a charter school complex in Delano, and donated $750 million to Caltech for environmental research, among other philanthropic acts. For comparison, assuming Forbes' estimations are correct, would be about 10% of the $8 billion wealth. And according to this article, the water that they use for the Kern Water Bank is rainwater put into the ground, which would otherwise go out to sea and get no value. But California's agriculture industry has a lot of problems stemming from the lack of governance and long-term planning. Wealthy people exploiting the system is simply a symptom of the problem. So, what can we actually do about it? On a personal level, this BBC article has a chart from this study that shows soy and oat milk are your best options in terms of emissions, land use and water use. But from the perspective of the almond growers, they tend to value their own on-farm observations rather than rely on things like scientific studies. Another study surveyed almond growers in California to understand their incentives for adopting bee-friendly practices. And one thing that was notable is that growers depend on managed honeybees, so they have been less concerned about native bee populations as a result. There is also an interesting dynamic between beekeepers and almond growers that growers are less likely to adopt bee-friendly practices if they thought bee colonies were already strong, which actually penalizes beekeepers who bring strong colonies, since the bees wouldn't have access to diverse forage during crop bloom. Obviously, there are more findings in the study, including their main argument that almond growers from different regions require a different set of approach due to different reasons like rainfall patterns, temperatures, water districts and rights, and social communities. But the rest is really not for a YouTuber who is not a scientist, nor a farm owner, nor a billionaire, but who is just a fat boy to figure out. Because the story of farmers versus conservationism has already happened before. Not for bees, but for a fish no longer than 3 inches called the Delta Smelt. In that case, there were scientists who warned about the species dying off as a 30-year career, and also a sociologist that wrote a 147-page dissertation for his PhD that, I'm oversimplifying here, essentially complaining about the problem causing environmental decline in California. In typical American fashion, the cause is politics. A version of this story can also be watched in a 45-minute documentary presented by Sakas Mitron. But here's the shorter version. By the late 1980s, scientists had already begun noticing Delta Smelt numbers lowering, subsequently being listed under the Endangered Species Act, aka the ESA, in 1993. The fish is also called an indicator species that can somewhat represent the health of the Delta ecosystem. And that was the start of a nearly half-a-century battle between environmentalists and farmers, which basically mirrors what happened with the bees above. Environmentalists wants to save the Delta Smelt, which would require some measures that reduce and regulate water usage. Farmers want to use the water to farm. Spoiler alert, As of 2022, the Delta smelt, which is endemic to California, is already functionally extinct, and most of them can only be found in hatcheries. You see, the thing is, the ESA isn't actually very effective at preventing extinction. They have an emergency approach to biodiversity conservation, which means that they only protect species when those species are nearing extinction, which by the time they are listed may already be too far gone to save. And while the law is focused on specific species, conservation doesn't really work like that. They require the whole ecosystem to be taken into consideration, which is a major problem when you consider that under the system of conservation in California, science is in subordination to the law. So much so that a geologist and prominent water policy professional referred to the United States District Court Mercurial Judge as the chief scientist for the Delta. The result is that scientists were often forced to narrow their concerns to fit the framework of the ESA, which doesn't really solve any problems at all. Resources and time were funneled into what he called combat science, which are funded research which primarily support pre-existing legal and political positions. This would be effective for the legal needs in court, but doesn't do anything for conservation in the long run. Pumping restrictions was only one of many things required to save the ecosystem, but the ESA had narrowly changed that to only pumping restrictions, and only for the Delta smelt. It's kinda like if the house is burning down, but instead of putting out the fire and rescuing the residents, you just kept splashing water only on one of them. Outside of California, the Delta smelt has also become a political weapon for figures like Donald Trump to attack the other party. The author of that 147-page PhD dissertation ran an analysis of publications regarding the Delta smelt, and found that publications within California tended to be pretty balanced, with a slight skew towards pro-conservation. But outside of California, 77% of the publications show a negative view of environmental protections. Much of those negative views would include a fish versus man narrative, accusing environmentalists of pumping water and taking away jobs and GDP to save a stupid little fish, which isn't actually even a thing. According to a study in 2019, they actually found a higher proportion of water was used for productive uses, meaning a lower proportion left towards the fish. And we've already seen the ending, along with 11 other indigenous delta fish species gone forever. Remember what I said about the shit show? It's gonna get worse. We still haven't mentioned anything about California water rights and how complicated that is, but I don't really want to read or talk about it. There's really no conclusion to any of this. Worst case scenario, we're watching the rapid decline of the states of America. Best case scenario, my almonds are getting more expensive.